Greetings. Welcome to the Seeds of Toby podcast 3. We were going to only do three podcasts for the introduction to this book. We're actually going to go into four on this book. And again, this is the Seeds of Toby podcast, a podcast created to promote my book, The Seeds of Toby. There you go. Boom, boom, boom. Secondarily, a podcast created to engender thoughts around the focus of the book as it relates to today's society, things going on in our culture, so on and so forth, and certainly with regard to the criminal justice system, public defender work, and various other entities that work within the criminal justice system. So, welcome to the Seeds of Toby podcast number 3, and I appreciate you all being here today. I wanted to say at the top of this podcast, I've just jumped in. Well, I wouldn't say I've been writing for a while, but this is my third or so publication that's going to get out there in the airways, if you will. First book, of course, dissertation, and then another writing I did through my doctoral school. But I'm starting this business into writing because I love to write, and also very passionate about the work that I do and all the different things that it flows into. So I'm starting to do some writings in that regard. So I have another book coming out. It's on its way. But this is my first, so admittedly, I made a couple of mistakes on the first try. And one of those mistakes was I did not go through the editing process as confidently or as knowledgeable as I should have. And my publisher had seemed like an AI editor. I didn't understand some things, and I hit yes to some editing. So some of you may have gotten the first version of the book, which had some grammar errors in it. Let me know about that. The second version should be out pretty soon here. It is 2/17/2025. The book came out a couple of months ago, but we're getting that new version out that has those errors out of it. And if you want an additional book without those errors and the additions that were put in the book, let me know. I will purchase that and get that for you as a person that's already bought the book. So I just want to get that note out there. I made a mistake, not the publisher. I didn't understand everything, and in my impatience, I hit, yeah, great. And it wasn't great. And we had to go back and get some edits, and I didn't look at it, whatever. Anyway, so if you bought a book and you do have the book with some of the, and there's not a lot of them, but there are enough of them that can scare the heck out of you, particularly a new author. Let me know and I can get you a new book. Contact me on my website. And then I'll have some stuff at the end of this podcast, so you can, if you need to, get a hold of me to get that book for free. The second one. Okay, to start off this third podcast, I wanted to read the advertising section of the back of the book, and certainly maybe you've read it. But I asked the question, why is there continued racial disparity within the American criminal justice system? Huge question. 2025, we still have this. And it adds in some residual rhetorical questions, questions that I've heard people say, yeah, this is the reason. Is it a natural propensity for crime? I've heard people say racial disparities are because of this propensity of crime. And that goes way back to some nasty stuff, racist stuff. But anyways, I've heard it. I've heard it even up until today. Is it a racial criminal justice system that causes racial disparities in the criminal justice system? Is it the culture of poverty or poverty? Is it the war on drugs that cause racial disparity in the criminal justice system? Is it dysfunctional family structures? I've heard that as well. Well, those minorities, African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, it's the family, blah, blah, blah. I've heard that. Is it choices? We often hear, though, you make choices, blah, blah, blah. Is it economics? Is it a spiritual issue? I've heard that also. Oh, it's a spiritual issue why people make mistakes in our right? In our hyper Christianized nation that often gets it way off the mark. I won't even go there. Okay, anyways. Is it a lack of education? That has been taught as well. That's a reason for it. How about mental health? Is it identity? And as you know, I'm a proponent of the latter question, but we'll get into that. But it goes on to read in the back of the book where it kind of entices you to get into the book. Among the various issues within the crime and punishment, and the fact that African Americans and other minorities disproportionately engulf jails, prisons, and probation caseloads. Why is it that so many are in the criminal justice system and continue to be at rates that continually plague the American communities? How about the aspects of historical trauma and improper identity paradigms? How about the fact that criminality has become normality? How about the old biblical adage that says, as a man thinks, so is he? There is, and I go on to write, there is a cultural identity crisis in many that frequent in the criminal justice system, and amid the various efforts to correct and change behavior, address their measures, and ensure that the criminal justice system yields evidence-based practice and strength-based treatment modalities. The system sadly lacks a cultural competence that would change the new Jim Crow in the face of crime in America. As much as activism and advocacy has rightfully focused on the racist aspects of criminal justice system that has improperly and historically overloaded the criminal justice system, the movement must be more thorough, after generations of minorities were incarcerated and overwhelmed by the collateral consequences of imprisonment, breaking a historical trauma that has grown over centuries. The system must incorporate ethnocentric treatment components focused on change in identity paradigms, and I want to go there. What would that mean, and why is that important? And I ask that question because this book, although it seeks to, and I said this in the last podcast, seeks to expose an issue, it also seeks to give answers to the issue. And certainly as an academic, as a person who works in the criminal justice system, as a social worker and mitigation specialist, it's one thing to expose said problems. It's another thing to give solutions to the problem. So this book does that. This book goes deep into the idea of historical trauma, highlighting Michelle Alexander's notion of the new Jim Crow and speaking to causality, as well as hints toward the notion of what the Kerner Commission report in 1967, President Johnson's report, brought out about urban sprawl or urban areas, certainly speaking toward African Americans and some of the crime issues that we continue to see in some of today's urban spots continually, right? But it spoke to poverty and the bigger holistic view of poverty, and brought in the idea of the new Jim Crow. Now, this big Kerner Commission report, as I see research, did not get followed, but it was a huge report in 1967. And it brought out the idea you can't concentrate folks into urban or any enclave, right? And have the issues of them being impoverished, adding racism, that adds in the element of behavior and crime. We'll take a look at the areas of crime in America, then unpack the often historic or cultural dynamics in those areas. Think about the idea of intersectionality in those communities. And then it'll bring you back to why the Kerner Commission report, 1967, big era, was very bold to say, this is bigger than economics. Economics is only just one part of the issue here. And thankfully, out of that era was born before the Kerner Commission report, 1963, Gideon versus Wainwright was born. But I think it was born, as I look at the era, although it was a law, Supreme Court law, was born into a lot of unrest around poverty, race, around this issue of inequality, intersectionality, and what's going on. Because it was easy to say crime a lack of having problems was because of these people, but it didn't take into account, okay, what are the bigger issues um, that lead into these problems? That said, and obviously known, we can debate causality. We truly can. And to a degree, what I espouse in this book can be debated, although there's some various quality research in this book, but it could be debated. But there is no debates about the obvious issue of disparities and their continual issues. The biggest of which, and I'll use a couple. Um, African Americans being only around 13-14% of the nation, yet 36 to 40% of America's criminal justice system, jails, prisons, probation caseloads. Take Native Americans and the totality of the issues that they dealt with. I'm in Minnesota at this time. 1% of Minnesota, yet 9% of the criminal justice system, prisons, jails, probation caseloads, and prisons. That's horrible. And the question is, why does this stuff exist? Why do disparities exist in the criminal justice system? And what should be done about it? Now, I've been in this work for almost 20 years, and there's often an acknowledgement of the obvious. There are disparities in the criminal justice system, disproportionate impact, disproportionality. You can go on with the words, and there even have been various efforts nationally and locally in the various states that I've been able to work in to speak to this issue. Certainly very sensitive to this issue. Now we're in 2025 and just embarked on the new 2025, the new political regime. And as I said in podcast one, it'll be interesting if the attack on DEI becomes the attack on social justice, which becomes the attack on criminal justice reform. And if it does, it will certainly nullify or seek to nullify thoughts that are brought across in this book. But the truth of the matter is, these things exist. And for debate, we can say, well, Donovan, this whole cultural identity crisis or whatever you're espousing in this book, yeah, it's debatable, but we can't debate the disparity issues. And as I opened up with the advertising of my book, the question is, why? Then the question is, since we know the causality, we know that crime, historic crime, collective crime exists, what are we going to do about it? The next question is, what can be done differently? One of the biggest times, as we've spoken to in this book, and if you're very familiar with criminal justice, 1995, the tough on crime era, some have said that was the ushering in, although it's not, or the blowing up of probably disparities in the criminal justice system. The war on drugs became the war on Black and brown people. We can allow you to debate it if you want to, but the question is, this has been going on since 1995, and although it's been going on way longer than that, what needs to be done differently to change the disparities in the criminal justice system? That's the big question, because what we don't often realize, or perhaps the taxpayer doesn't realize, or maybe they do, and there's some definite deep-rooted racism there. Not dealing with the disparity issue, not dealing with crime in this way, looking at it holistically, Corner Report, it's not just poverty, it's deeper, means you're going to deal with recidivism and public safety issues. Look at our urban areas again, and even maybe some of our rural areas where there's an enclave of the impoverished, purposely so. What needs to be done? What can be done differently? This book explores the idea of what can and should be done differently from my vantage point as a mitigation specialist and a social worker, also as someone who's worked in the criminal justice system as a police officer, treatment supervisor, youth counselor, chemical dependency youth counselor, on and on and on. It looks at this idea of what can be done differently, because we have to do something differently to change the plight of disparities in the criminal justice system. And also, which we don't talk about, and I understand why we don't talk about it, it's a public safety issue as well. And so this book, as noted, and as I alluded to, goes into the idea of a cultural identity crisis and adds on about 4 anchors of what we can do to deal with that to better our criminal justice system. Because if our criminal justice system isn't changing the plight of disparities, that means it's failing. Some would say it's purposely failing, Donovan. It wants Black and brown lives in the criminal justice system. And that may be true, and I'll allow that debate to rage as well. My question is then, and this book seeks to go into that, what are you going to do about the public safety piece? And again, this book goes into, not only exposes what I call a cultural identity crisis, which I think is key to, one of the keys to changing disparities in the criminal justice system, but it also goes into, okay, if that is the case, what can be done to change that? And that's I think one of the beauties of the book, one of the beauties of what I've learned professionally and personally. And I think it's something that our criminal justice system needs to begin to think about, whether it comes through in the vantage point of how I unpack it or another way. The criminal justice system needs to go deeper to change these issues. If not, it's derelict of duty, right? And also efforts towards advocacy, social justice, civil rights. We need to not only be on the front end, as my book alludes to on the back of the book, with civil rights activism, but we also need to say, okay, guess what? This issue has been going on for eons, for hundreds of years. And so now we have people who have been culturally impacted by the criminal justice system. What do we need to do internally, macro, holistically to make sure that we're changing the plight here? Because we can be active and do these various things, which we have to do, but we have to think folks have been impacted, families, generations. Just take again, let's not go 100 years ago, which we know of. Let's just go since 1995. If we say the tough on crime era was impactful on Black and brown lives, what has it done to mothers, fathers, children, on and on and on? And then what can we do to change that plight? So again, this book goes into that, and it's an interesting book here in 2025. Again, we are on the cusp of some serious issues. And again, my concern is, as a social work and mitigation specialist, are we dealing with the thwarting or the closing out of not only DEI but social justice and criminal justice reform? So go out and get the book Seeds of Toby. Thank you for being in on this podcast 3 of the Seeds of Toby podcast. The book is out on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all your major book outlets. Go out and get it. Nice to see you again.